Welcome back. You're watching HFO-TV.
Welcome back to HFO-TV. I'm Greg Frick, partner at HFO Investment Real Estate. Here today, we've got the special privilege of having two guests today on HFO-TV. We've got Mike Wilkerson, economist with Econ Northwest. Thank you very much. And we have back again Gerald Milner, the academic director for the Center of Real Estate at Portland State University. Thanks again for both of you for coming. And we kind of want to talk a little bit about kind of the topic of the day in Portland is, affordability in terms of, the market here, multifamily, kind of our audience, but housing in general. Maybe we could give a little rundown, Mike, in terms of when people say affordability, that's kind of a wide arching. Are we talking, the homeless people on the street? Are we talking teachers? Kind of give a little broad kind of look of what that means when somebody says that.
Sure, and I think, to your point, this is a big topic for the day, and for everyone it really means, what their area of most interest is.
Right.
And the big distinction that I like to think about is, are we talking about ownership or are we talking about rental? Okay. That's the biggest discussion point. Are we focusing on one, ownership or rental, or both, right? And on the renter side of things, that's where we get into tying our incomes level, right? So you're saying 0 to 30 is our traditionally homeless.
Right.
And then it moves up from there into what we can consider the government regulated supported side of things. So that's generally up to 60% of median family income. We have workforce housing as this next tranche is from 60 to 120% of median family income. Beyond 120%, you generally don't see any government interventions, but certainly the pricing can continue on up from there. We kind of think of that as this housing ladder from 0 all the way up.
Okay.
On the ownership side of things, it's more difficult. I think any individual owner, sure, they benefit from their house appreciating.
Right.
But for people who are looking to transition into the market or trade up, it becomes difficult. And again, generally it's tied to some measure of income. The difficult policy discussions are when we're talking about affordability, we have to have some measure of a down payment established to tie that to the affordability. So are we talking about a 5% down payment with PMI? Okay. Are we targeting that, or are we targeting a traditional conventional loan at 20%? Second order would be if we have HOA payments, right? So when we look at affordability, generally we're talking about utilities, taxes, payment, insurance, all of that. So when you look at condos separately from single-family homes, again, affordability becomes a much different topic.
Got it. And I know you guys do a lot of work with municipalities and kind of giving studies. Have they been open to this kind of discussion? Or is it just, you hear a lot of rhetoric, especially in an election year, of these broad kind of overriding scopes of things, but there's really no definition. Is that something you guys kind of help bring to the surface of, just saying we're going to fix affordable housing really doesn't address, like you said, what part of the ladder are we really looking to address? Yeah,
and it really depends upon, generally, is it a mandatory program or a voluntary program? Oftentimes when they have voluntary programs, they say, okay, here are the incentives we have in play that we think are reasonable. At that point, you would generally tie a reasonable offset with those incentives to some measure of affordability. But on mandatory programs, generally they can set whatever they want. And we see that varied across the country. And at that point, generally, they either have a policy in mind and they want to understand the implication of that policy, or they're looking at trading off various policies and want to understand if we offer, let's say, a deeper discount on a targeted MFI basis, but a lower set aside, so less number of units.
Right.
What does that trade-off look like versus if we require more units but at a higher income level?
Got it.
I mean, I think when you look then at inclusionary zoning policies across the country, there's about 3 or 4 different dimensions in which that policy can be defined. And some of those inclusionary policies can be quite exclusionary. In other words, make it very difficult to develop housing if you have a high set aside, if you have a very low income threshold that you have to make the units affordable for, and then a long time period for which to have that affordability in place.
Mm-hmm. And just to let everybody know, Oregon did pass an inclusionary zoning now, so now it's going to, each municipality to kind of work out the program themselves. And I think you were saying September, November is when we'll think Portland's going to be ready with their kind of plan or how they're going to roll that out.
Yeah, so the city's timetable is they're hoping to adopt by the end of the year.
Right.
So in order to meet that timetable, generally you need to have a draft proposal sometime in and around September.
Okay. And then go over, I was going to say, your comment, I mean, you guys have been involved from the Portland State side, Center of Real Estate, very involved in the kind of the city politics and kind of what's going on here and studies on that. Kind of what's your take on what we've seen or what's, where it's looking, it's heading?
Well, I think the distinction I always try to make is between affordable housing, which is a particular product type within the real estate industry.
Right.
It's what we produce in order for people of low means to be able to afford housing, and housing affordability, which is the general pattern of rents and prices. And if you look nationally, less than half the people who are below the poverty line receive any kind of assistance for their housing. So most poor people rent at market prices. And my concern is that we're not really building enough housing. I think there's a lot of barriers that we've put in place to prevent the building of housing, both single-family homes as well as apartments. And those barriers, which from an investor's point of view sound great, but those barriers are causing our prices to be high. That in turn is leading the city to try to come up, and the state to try to come up with policies to provide subsidized housing. I think from an academic point of view, the literature suggests that this is not a very good way to try to solve the problem.
To solve that, yeah. Yeah, I think, yes, from an investor standpoint, it is great to a point, but it's to a point of when you start getting, like you said, policies put in place for short-term, issues that we've had, a bubble, whatever you want to call it, a building shortage. Policies that, we're going to have to unwind all these policies because, the fear is we put inclusionary zoning, we put affordability components, we're limiting, put more barriers of entry, fees on terms of new construction, cut supply. Well, if we lose supply, and we have to continue demand, what's that going to do to pricing? So,
I mean, right now, Portland's role within the economy, I think, is to attract a lot of people from California who are fleeing high housing costs.
Right.
Our comparative advantage is our relative affordability compared to California.
California and Seattle, yes.
But the problem is that there are a lot of metropolitan areas with nice quality of life, which are a short airplane flight from the Silicon Valley, right? You could live in Denver, you could live in Salt Lake City, you could live in Austin, Texas, you could live in Phoenix. And to me, we're playing on a knife edge right now. If we put too many of these barriers in place and we make housing too expensive, these other markets are going to outcompete for that kind of business.
Right, and then you're looking at unwinding and trying to re-bring the group back after, which is tough. It's like a big ship. It's kind of hard to change direction once you go down, once you start heading down a path to change that. I know we've heard here is, conditions of a housing emergency. Is that unique to Portland? Are you seeing that in other cities in the West Coast, on the West, just in curiosity of, how we relate to some of the others? You brought up Denver, you brought up Salt Lake, Austin. What is your take on that?
Sure. So, I think, like Jerry was saying, everything is relative. So,
right.
You're oftentimes in your local market considered bad. So we look at a couple of measures. We look at, is this really, I think it's nationally, it is a problem that's been getting worse as the housing market has recovered and incomes have stagnated, right? So there's two prongs to this housing affordability. It's your income side of things. If
right.
incomes aren't going up and prices are, we have a problem. So we look at that broadly as a price to income ratio on an ownership standpoint. Portland is at 4.6 roughly. So the value of the home is 4.6 times greater than 1 year's salary.
Okay.
Nationally, the median is about 3.3. So we're higher, and we're roughly the 15th worst market nationally. So traditionally, 3% is thought 3-to-1 ratio is thought of as kind of a.
Now, are those other markets strict? More of the West Coast.
Certainly, definitely. Yeah.
Okay.
LA is the worst. San Francisco is right behind.
Okay.
We're stacking up, but again, if we look at the top 100 markets, we're 15th. So we don't have a lot further to go. And I think that's Jerry's point is
right.
At a certain point, relatively, we don't look affordable anymore. And then there's implications for that. On the rent side of things, you can look at just rent burden. So this is percent of people who spend more than 30%, which is thought of as an appropriate standard. In Portland right now, we're around 50%, which is about the median. And we're the 26th worst metro in that area.
In terms of rent burden,
percent of people who are renters who pay more than 30%
okay.
is about 55% in Portland. And this nationally, the median is about 50%. Where I think in Portland, we're starting to see more of an issue is what we call extreme rent burden. And those are people who are paying more than 50% of their income. So 30 is what we ideally want. 50 is kind of another measure of when we start to see extreme problems. And in Portland right now, we have 30%. So I think we're at the high end in terms of just general rent burden, but as we move up to this extreme, we start to see more problems, and vacancy rates are very low here.
Right.
So you start to see price pressure happening there. So yeah, it's a national problem, but certainly Portland is one of the worst markets and getting worse.
In terms, yes.
And appreciating the fastest. I mean, we've seen Portland hit the top of the table in the axiometric surveys that I've seen the last 2 years, and that's a big worry.
Yeah, both rental and ownership. I think for the last 7 months, we've been the highest of the top 20 markets in the Case-Shiller
Yeah, I just saw that
for single
yeah.
family. So it's rental market's been very strong in Portland, and now we've surpassed Seattle and San Francisco, and the rest of the ownership market nationally has kind of cooled off a little bit from where we were 2 years ago. It's about 5.5% now. Portland has continued to slug along at 12 to 13% a year, surpassed Seattle even in terms of ownership affordability, and on the rental side, it's equally bad.
If it's in Portland, typically they'll stay in a little longer on the upticks. I mean, we usually kind of last in and kind of linged out a little bit longer typically.
That was certainly true in the housing bust. Us and Charlotte were the last two that experienced a housing bust, but it was as severe here as anywhere else. We lost 30% of value if you look at single-family homes. I think what people may or may not have noticed is that we've made that ground up entirely. Our average home price is as high as it ever was. Our rents are certainly never fell and are as high as they ever were.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, no, we definitely surpassed that.
So
Yes.
I think that this problem is a chronic problem for Portland, and I think that the question is how do we respond moving forward?
So what are kind of some of the policy options or responses often used, and kind of we can maybe talk about those as to, hey, this is what you'll typically see maybe on the public side, what our thoughts are and how that has addressed the problem. Does it exacerbate the problem, long term? And that's I think that's kind of the concern of the market, and a lot of our audiences. Again, you've got policies being made for this. Again, it's been hot. We've had record appreciation, but what's the long-term effect of doing those policies, and is that really the unintended consequences actually make the situation worse than what we started with?
25 years ago, I wrote a dissertation on rent regulation and housing policy in New York, and I thought that would be the end of my career on that topic. I moved to Portland. I moved to a place where you could buy a new house for $120,000. You could find a fixer-upper for less than $100,000. And this market took off. Did my personal net worth a lot of good, but I think from the point of view of young people coming of age, leaving their parents' house if they can move out of the basement, move out of a doubled up situation and find their own apartment. I think it's a real problem, and I think the basic problem is that we're a growth constrained market. We have a planning system and an ideology which is top down and centralized as far as our land supply, and we've expanded the urban growth boundary in minimal ways, very small amount. Less than 10% in the last 40 years, and we're eating up all of the good land. And what's left over are the rattier pieces, the pieces with a lot of slope.
Hard to develop, infrastructure's hard to get to it, yes.
And now if you talk to the urban planners in our region, they'll say, well, we can build up rather than grow out, right? That was the mantra that I remember in 1995,
yes. Grow
up or grow out. It's a very ideological kind of statement. Right? Who wants to grow out? That sounds like you're getting fat. Shouldn't we all grow up? But growing up and growing with higher density is very costly, right? Garden apartments, rent for about $1 to $1.20. That's probably some reflection of the cost of construction. If you go to 4/1 construction, in other words, a 5-story apartment, like we see a lot of here on Division, that's $1.70 to $1.90. If you go beyond that, you have to use concrete and steel construction. That's $2.70 to $2.90. So, this idea that we're going to grow up basically means that we're going to accept high housing costs.
And we see that in the market. I think it's consistent across the market that there's this notion of filtering, right? So when you build new housing stock, it comes in higher than, let's say, the median income or at the higher end of the spectrum.
Right.
And over time, it becomes what we call, naturally affordable.
Right. Your buildings today being built are going to be your affordable units.
Correct.
10 years from now.
And I think part of the problem, and this gets at exactly what Jerry was saying, is because of regulation, the types of buildings that can be built are limited. And as a result, the rents on those buildings now are much higher than they traditionally have been. So we're seeing something like a 40% premium on new construction. So new construction in the market, I just pulled the data, is about $1,775 a month. Anything built since 2014.
Okay.
As a market as a whole, we're a little bit less than $1,300 a month, as the average. So that's a 40% spread. So on average, based on national studies, and it varies by market, but roughly it's 2.5% a year. So if you have a 40% delta to make up at 2.5% a year, this is not happening overnight. And
No.
regulation, some of that has to do with the fact that the types of construction that can be built affordably are difficult because of regulations. We have requirements requiring ground floor retail, active uses, parking requirements and the like, certainly not allowing density in neighborhoods, this kind of notion of missing middle housing, where you can build affordably in and around, let's say, maybe not 80% of median family income, but maybe up to 120%. From there, you're close to where you want to be, and then filtering kind of gets you down to that 80%, and then the government can further subsidize and incentivize below that. But what we're seeing now is we're in and above 130, 140% of median family income right from the get-go, and it just takes that much longer for that stock to filter down to a traditionally affordable level.
And this is a very inefficient way to be providing assistance for low-income households, right? I mean, if you were to try to identify, a low-income household, the best thing you can do for them is to offer them cash or offer them a voucher.
Right.
Let them shop in the market to try to find that house or that apartment that's filtered, like Mike was describing, because they're going to be able to judge housing compared to all of their other needs. They're going to think, is it close to where I want to work?
Right.
Do I like the schools? Is it the right configuration for what my household needs? Providing them a particular unit might match, but it probably doesn't quite match what their needs are. The literature suggests there's probably a 30% efficiency loss when you give people a particular unit rather than giving them a voucher. And if you're giving them something new, you're giving them something at a much higher price point than they would charge. And that kind of new construction, I think it appeals a lot to public officials because they'd rather cut a ribbon on a brand new project rather than the typical project that a middle income or lower income household would normally rent.
So where, just in where we are, there are other cities that, people could look at and say, they went through this, or are we all kind of coming in this at the same time? I know, the past, but anything recently, I mean, is Seattle ahead of us, behind us? You brought up Austin, Denver. I mean, I'm assuming that we know San Francisco is kind of its own in terms of affordability and, rent control and things like that. What do you guys, is there something you look at and point to say, hey, public official, look at, this is the policy that they have done, look at where it's ended up?
Well, I mean, I think the literature is somewhat mixed, but broadly speaking, and we're just finishing up a report with ULI looking at kind of the effectiveness of various inclusionary zoning policies across the country over time, you don't see inclusionary zoning as fixing the problem, right? It certainly helps, but it's one tool in a toolkit. There's no silver bullet, right? You can't just say, well, inclusionary zoning will solve this problem. I think that being said, that there are better ways to go about designing a policy so you don't stifle market development while trying to get affordable units. But regardless, that policy in and of itself won't, certainly in Portland, solve the problem. I think even Portland Housing Bureau has started to identify this in some of their literature that they're producing. They're saying that currently they have a shortage of about 25,000 units right now today, and that in the comp plan they expect to accommodate another 10,000 through 2035, so roughly 35,000 units.
Based on the change of zoning of some, yes.
So if that delta of 35,000 units, right now they're saying, okay, even with an inclusionary zoning policy, they suspect over that roughly 20 years, maximum 5,000 units, maybe 2,000 units. So if you have a 35,000 unit problem, right, and inclusionary zoning is only one tool, and certainly getting the policy right to not stifle market development, it has to be at the top of the list in terms of goals, but certainly getting inclusionary zoning isn't going to solve the problem. Seattle took a little bit different approach, and they're looking at a linkage fee. So they're collecting revenue rather than requiring delivery of units. And that's certainly an option. I think having an opt-out is always an option. The question is really about efficiency. If you can build a unit for less than it costs to get a subsidized unit in the market, that's a decision that you can make, and you don't have to be at the whim of markets to where you're buying units at the most expensive time as far as land and construction costs. You can pool those dollars, you can land bank, you can be more strategic about deploying public dollars rather than bringing in a policy at the top of the market and hoping that you get a delivery of units in the short run.
I would say that nothing beats having a well-functioning housing market to begin with.
Yes.
And I think that there are plenty of states, typically in the Southwest and the Southeast. I'm thinking of cities like Dallas, Austin, Atlanta, Houston, Orlando, where there basically aren't that many constraints on development.
Right.
And in those markets, you can have plenty of demand, and it builds a lot of units, but it doesn't push up price very much. And I think the problem that we've got into on the East Coast and as well as on the West Coast has been that we've put in these constraints for all sorts of reasons that have made it difficult to develop housing. In our state, we have a top-down system where every single parcel in the state is zoned, and we have limits on where you can build a new subdivision. Nobody's building new large-scale subdivisions anymore, and that's focusing all the demand on the center. And so I think for a young person growing up, I think they've got a hard problem to face, right? If they can get a great job, if they can become an engineer, an accountant, an economist maybe, they can afford housing and they can afford to stay in the place that they grew up in. And I think the problem for our children will be that they're going to say, Mom, Dad, I'm going to have to move to Atlanta. I'm going to have to move to Charlotte. That's where the jobs are. That's where I'm going to go. And the irony is that these environmental restrictions that we've put on land use were done with the idea of improving the environment. If you were to take any place in the United States where you'd like to see people live with a very minimal impact on carbon emissions, you'd say California, Oregon, Washington State, where you don't have a lot of heating and cooling costs. Instead, we're sending them to Atlanta, Houston, Dallas, Charlotte. These are places with very high energy costs. So it's not even clear to me that we're getting the environmental benefit that we think we are.
By doing what? By restricting
By restricting the development in the Willamette Valley.
And just to further what Jerry was saying, we're already seeing that in the data as far as the household formation in Portland. If you look back since the last recession in 2007, essentially there's been no household formation below $100,000. At the very low end, there's been household formation, recent college graduates and the like. In the middle, there are less households now earning, let's say, $50,000 to $75,000 than there were 6, 7, 8 years ago. Almost half has been between 100 and 150,000, and the other half above 150,000. For that very reason, if you can get a job, you can afford to live in the city, you stay. If you can't, you go leave and you look
go somewhere. You end up yes.
Or you delay household formation, right? So we're seeing a huge number of millennials still living at home or doubling up, et cetera, not forming their own household, which ultimately is, spurs economic growth in the future.
Well, it isn't very nice. It isn't a very fun prospect to try to raise a family in your mom's basement, right?
That is true. Yes. And the policymakers, you think, grasp that in terms of, what's going on and where it may, if we continue this policy of restricting housing, restricting development, making housing more expensive, just the simple economics of it. You restrict supply, and when we have continued demand, at some point, demand will taper off, and what you've kind of come to protect may not be the issue.
I think the understanding of how the housing market works is complex and is not well understood, both by the general public as well as by our public officials. I heard the current mayor of the city of Portland say at a meeting, "Well, gee, why can't we just build apartments? Aren't they cheaper?" Well, that's kind of beside the point. If your vision of apartments is even modest to high density,
right,
it's going to be more expensive on a dollar per square foot basis. So I think that, I think the other disconnect is that 2/3 of our households are homeowners, and so they look at the problem of high housing costs as building their retirement fund. And the people who are left out of that conversation are renters, are new immigrants to the country. I don't think they have nearly as much voice in our political process as the role they play in our economy.
And there are economic consequences for that as well. Certainly the home building industry, contracting, skilled trades, are a good, solid kind of family wage jobs that have been lost and haven't returned because of the stifled growth. I think in the city of Portland, in Metro Portland, we roughly 4,000 less construction workers now than we did at the peak, right? So that's a big problem, is when you have this boom and bust, but then over time, the ability to deliver that product becomes more expensive because, just simple supply and demand. If you're overworked as a contractor, sure, I'll just bid up my price more, and if you want to build, you'll pay the price. If not, you won't. And that's not a great way to kind of reconcile the need for more housing units when policy is kind of encouraging that increased business cycle that otherwise would be there.
I mean, I think we're seeing in the last 4 or 5 months kind of open season on the development industry. I think the city has put in all kinds of policies. There's a construction excise tax. There's an inclusionary zoning requirement. There was a doubling of system of development charges for parks. It was one of our biggest system development charges. I looked at Commissioner Saltzman's proposal for the construction excise tax, and the estimate I came up with is that you're paying 12% of your apartment construction budget for fees.
Right.
And that's beyond, that doesn't even include permitting fees. If you look at a design review, just about any place you could possibly build in the city of Portland is subject to design review, and that's a guaranteed 6 to 9 month delay. So there's a lot of sluggishness in the system that we've built into this, and it'll be interesting to see if the new mayor is going to try to tackle this and try to unpack some of these problems. But at the same time we say that, we also have a Speaker of the House who 2 years ago introduced legislation for rent control in the state of Oregon.
Right.
And so we'll see. We'll see.
I think it's difficult because, there are always the trade-offs, right? So with the CET, it generates revenue, right? And the estimate is over the next 20 years, that CET might fund 1,000 units of affordable housing. So if that's what we're gaining, what's the cost?
What's
right?
the cost of getting maybe 1,000 units of affordable housing?
Correct. So I think that's always the lens we have to look at things. And again, if you're looking to address the problem through regulation and subsidy, right, that can be some component of the market, but you can't expect to fix the problem just by focusing on that. And if the entire focus is how do we create more regulated subsidized units, that's going to come at a cost of the market units, and the market is what traditionally provides affordable housing, not regulation and subsidy. So I think this is the problem, is the conundrum is in the short run, that's the policy lever, right? No one wants to take a 20-year view on things. It's not politically feasible. Advocacy groups are clamoring for change now, and I think the problem is the cost to that can be very high. Right. So understanding the trade-offs associated with that, when you have other, unfunded PERS problems, you have education, funding decreasing over time. So these are the trade-off that I think is certainly worth discussing.
Well, from our standpoint, it's gotten, I think the the affordability of housing has become a political issue. And I think, in an election year, I think it's been very politicalized this year. I mean, we've talked about this before in our discussions. When you're talking affordability, and then you start bringing in homelessness. Is that really what the goal is, to address homelessness? Or are we looking to go, they both need to be addressed, but trying to do this wide arching, kind of promise regarding that, that's, like you said, there's different tranches of affordability. There's different solutions or potential solutions for each one of those, and how do you address those? But trying to do one kind of overriding deal, thinking that's going to fix it, is a little short-sighted. But again, we're not trying to get reelected, and they are, so it's an easy, right now, it seems the developers are the easy ones to go after in terms of, affordability. The other thing we kind of grapple with is when trying to get this message out to not just investors and owners. You can have investors and owners, developers, and you have the tenants. Looking at what the effect is on the homeowners. Yes, if we put in more housing, in theory, their housing may not be as valuable as we've had this run up. But then what's the cost of not doing that? What's the city going to lose down the road? And, is your house going to be worth that much if we don't have these, address some of these things?
Well, Greg, we just need more people watching HFO-TV.
Well, that's how we tried it. We were trying to push them to do that. But, and I know some of the groups are getting together, forming a legislative group to talk. We've been talking about rent control for 2 years. What really is the cost of putting in rent control? How does that really affect? I'd love to hear what you guys' take is on that.
You don't need to ask more than one economist what their thought is on rent control. It'd be tough to find someone who thought that was a good idea. I don't know that there's any economists.
No, it's something which will deter investment. It will lead to spaces, not being used very efficiently. I lived in the New York area for 7 years, and the attitude there is that if you find an apartment, it's always going to be the best place for you ever to live.
Right, you'll never move.
You'll never move. And I knew friends who'd lived in the same apartment for 40 years. And they were the ones who were buying a stove or buying an air conditioner to install permanently in that unit because they're going to live there till the day they died. Right. So and of course it's very unfair for people who are new arrivals. One of the things I did when I researched my book on New York's housing policy was to interview subtenants, sublets. And there's no regulation anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world that I'm aware of, where sublets are regulated. And that's how a lot of people find housing in New York. They find somebody who's a primary tenant, they become the secondary tenant. And I remember interviewing a poor lady who said, yeah, I pay, you know, X amount of dollars. In fact, I'm paying most of the rent. You know, there's no regulation on that sort of thing. So even if you think you're trying to help tenants generally, often you're helping one group of people but harming a lot of others. And I just think it's I hope we don't go to that step, but we also have to recognize that, you know, the place, the first state, the largest state where we have immigrants to Oregon is California. People from California are used to that kind of regulation, and we may pick up that disease.
Right. Which, you know, and it's it's a very vocal group. I mean, that's, you know, that is kind of the voice that's out there, and, you know, trying to get that message out to, as we've said, not just for the effect on the, you know, the owners, the investors, but what's the long-term effect of, you know, of rent control, and really looking at that from, you know, homeowners to tenants. And again, it's really hard to get people to take a long-term perspective on that, and it's, you know, even goes back to inclusionary zone. You start putting restrictions on supply. You know, what really, you're really solving, what's the cost of doing that, you know, not today, tomorrow, but what's that cost in 5 years? So,
I mean, New York has experienced now for, I think, 50 years a 1% vacancy rate. What does that mean? That means that if you do find a unit, you better take it. I can remember going to an apartment opening in Greenwich Village, and there were 40 people there who all arrived, and the agent walked in 5 minutes late, and he said, here are the applications, fill them out. Don't call us, we'll call you. And who are they going to pick? They're going to pick the person who's got the best job, the best income. As somebody modest like a student in those days, you know, we didn't have much of a chance. Right. And I think that's really what we're missing out on. We're missing out on the opportunity to be entrepreneurial. We're missing out on the opportunity to move to Portland, to move to a city, and bring our ideas to the table. And I think we will become, unless we change our policies, a slow-growing Western city, rather than the dynamic place we could be.
well, we talked about today with somebody. It's you know, we had all these plans put in place. You know, I think we've done a good job in urban planning in the beginning, and we've kind of now benefited from the fruits of those things. And it's almost now you kind of get a feeling that people are sitting back and wait a minute, I really didn't think we were going to be that successful. Now what do we do? And so it's, you know, we got to again take, you know, when they put that in back in the early 70s, it was a long-term plan. But to make these short-term little tweaks, or not even tweaks, if they're tweaks would be one thing. These are major, you know, policy changes, and what that's going to do. It's a little scary moving forward.
I think we need, you know, I think, and this is a challenge to people who are watching, I think we need a new generation of leaders in our metro area. I mean, I think we had folks who came of age in the 60s, right, who gave us policies in reaction to what they saw in California and elsewhere, trying to constrain some of the bad sides to suburban growth. I think we just need a new paradigm, a new set of policies. And I think part of that involves, you know, opening up our metropolitan area for development, restricting the places where we have architectural review, design review, and I think we should both grow up and grow out at the same time to provide more housing. Right now, we're producing 30% less housing units per year as a metro area than we did in 1990 to 2007, when rents and prices were much lower.
Right, and this is what the last year is the first time we haven't expanded urban growth boundary at all. Since, you know, we've had all this immigration and we don't expand the urban growth boundary, right, which, you know. So one last kind of, you got a parting shot you want to kind of put out, people get more information, and kind of, as we kind of try to wrap this up?
Sure. Like I said, we recently completed a study for ULI looking at the kind of best practices for putting together inclusionary zoning policy. That's available on the ULI website or our website, Echo Northwest. But yeah, I mean, I think just putting out the full range of options for public discourse, I think, is somewhere where we're lacking. So instead of just saying, here's one policy, it's, okay, here's a slew of policies. And so we've talked about construction excise tax, the bond measure, inclusionary zoning, rent control. Let's talk about missing middle housing. Let's talk about adding in ADUs. Let's talk about increasing the UGB in a way that makes sense, not just increasing it for the sake of increasing it, finding land that's actually buildable at a reasonable price, and understand the pros and cons associated with each of those, so then we can decide, okay, instead of it being a crisis, we have a choice in this. We can choose to stay on the same path, or we can educate ourselves and make thoughtful choices, understanding what the pros and cons are of those choices.
And is this battle, you think, more unique in the situation here because of the way we're, the political system here? Or is this something, every city is going to go through? Has there been, I guess, is there a successful model here, the States, Europe, wherever, where you could say, look, hey, this city B did this, city C did this, and look at the difference?
Yeah, I mean, there's trade-offs. So we've been very successful in placemaking. People want to move here, and as a result, labor prices are constrained because there's a lot of people who are educated and who want to live here. Conversely, prices go up. Or another option is you have areas where it's very affordable to live because there's not. So that's a trade-off, and I don't know that there's a best answer. Everyone has, there are always compromises you have to make. You can't, have your cake and eat it too, right? You have to be able to sacrifice something. Unfortunately, in Portland at the moment, and probably for the foreseeable future, that's something we're sacrificing is affordability.
Right.
I think it's tough to give good models for where we need to be. Often in part because we look at Portland as the last best place, right? I mean, all three of us live in Portland.
Right. Grew up here. Yeah.
We enjoy the climate, we enjoy the amenities. So if I'm going to tell you a Dallas story or a Houston story or an Atlanta story, I mean, it's like selling you warm beer. It doesn't taste very good.
Right.
But there are some places around the world. Seoul, South Korea, for example, lifted their greenbelt policy and allowed for more housing to be developed. So I think there are some examples that you can turn to where cities have really changed their paradigm in how they look at housing. Unfortunately, I worry that some of these kind of policies are like barnacles on a ship. They're hard to remove. So I would what I've been encouraging is for the real estate community to try to meet with the new mayor-elect and try to make sure their voices are heard. We're also going to have a major election in 2018 on our Metro Council where 4 members of that council are going to be termed out, and I think we need to be looking at those districts and seeing if we can find candidates who can speak to the needs of the real estate community, but also citizens generally looking for affordable places to live and economic development. I think that's where we need to turn.
Good. Well, thank you again for both of you coming. It was very enlightening, and we'll see you next time on HFO-TV. Thank you.
Our entire office specializes in multifamily real estate, making HFO the largest multifamily brokerage in the Pacific Northwest. Your success is our passion. Build your legacy with HFO. Call 503-241-5541 or visit our website at hfore.com for more information.